Nisa Barbara Banks. Welcome to BCTV Tonight. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you.
Talk to us about the early history of the Buffalo Challenger.
Well, the Challenger started in 1963 here in the city by a group of concerned citizens, among them Assemblyman Arthur O'Eve, Garfield Hinton, Ambrose Lane, June Carter, Andy Wright. There was about 10 concerned citizens who at that time felt that there was a need for a stronger voice in the African American community. And in 1963, as you know, that was the height of the movement, quote unquote. So there was a lot of activity going around locally and nationally. And they felt that we weren't getting a fair shake by the local media, and the black newspaper that was already in existence was basically Republican oriented. So the people, interestingly enough, who got involved with the Challenger were Democratic, and the Democrats had become our saviors by then. They had left the land of Lincoln, and we were ready to jump on the Democratic bandwagon. So the Challenger was like the Democratic black voice, and the alternate African newspaper was basically Republican. So that was sort of like the early years. And they dealt with a myriad of issues. Integration, integration of schools had just started. We were just steps from, getting away, actually being liberated. We're coming out of the 50s and into the 60s. So it was a very traumatic time, but a very good time to start a newspaper.
Nisa, talk to us about your background in the media.
My background in the media started actually when I was about 10 years old.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I grew up in the Black Rock section of Buffalo,
Okay.
Black Rock Riverside. And when I got my first typewriter, I was about 10 years old. For Christmas, one Christmas, I got a typewriter.
10 years old on
Yeah.
a typewriter, okay.
So I started hunting and pecking away at this newspaper that I started. I called it the Project News, and it was basically a gossip sheet.
I kind of like news from the
Yeah.
projects, right? Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I just talked about everything that was going on with everybody in the projects. And it was such a hit. I only had one sheet, and it just passed around and it just passed around. Well, I didn't do any more publishing after that until I got to college.
You didn't get any backlash over your gossip, did you?
No backlash from the Project News, but it was basically who liked who was seen,
Uh-oh.
who was seen at the store with how many bottles. It was a funny kind of little thing. I wish I still had a copy, but at any rate, I didn't do any more publishing until I got to college. My high school years, I didn't do very much at all. That's a whole nother story. But when I got to college, I was named the editor of the school paper. I went to Payne College in Augusta, Georgia. I did that for 3 years. I edited a few literary magazines for the college. And then I did an internship before I graduated at the Augusta Chronicle. I was the second African to ever work for the newspaper, and that was an experience. And when I graduated, I came back to Buffalo thinking that, well, I'll just come home and get a job in the local media.
I was going to ask you before you got to that, what was that experience like, if you
The experience in the Augusta Chronicle?
Yeah.
Well, the experience in the Augusta Chronicle, it was in the late 60s, maybe, yeah, late 60s. And many of the people that I was sent to interview and deal with had never seen the likes of an African reporter. In fact, there was almost no such thing. And one incident that really, really stays with me, and that's been many, many years ago, was I was sent to interview Miss South Carolina. And South Carolina and Augusta, Georgia, the border is like Buffalo, Cheektowaga, kind of. You think you're still in Augusta, but you're actually in South Carolina, and there's no borders or anything. At any rate, it was right across the river, and I went to the door to interview Miss South Carolina, and a black woman, the maid, came to the door. Well, when she saw me, she was alarmed because she was wondering, I guess, what I was doing in the neighborhood. And she immediately became defensive and asked me what I wanted, and I told her that I was from the newspaper and that I had come to interview Miss South Carolina, and she slammed the door in my face and went and got her boss, the lady of the house. And the lady of the house came to the door. I mean, I was a spectacle, and she peeks through the door and asked me again in that nice southern drawl, what did I want? And I told her that I was the reporter that was sent to interview her daughter from the Augusta Chronicle. She shut the door on me and went back into the house. Well, I guess they called the newspaper to confirm it. And finally, they let me in the house. The black woman, the maid, was quite nervous. You know, I don't know. It was that kind of, when I went to Augusta, black people were still moving to the back of the bus.
Okay.
So it was fresh. All this asserting our power was fresh. But that was the gist of what it was like working in the South at that time as a reporter. Racism is an understatement in terms of my experience, but it was a good experience. So when I left there and I came here, I had pretty much experience under my belt, and I thought it would be fairly easy to get a job at home, even though I really didn't want to come back here. It was family that brought me back. But it took me I'd say 5 or 7 years to finally get a job here. It was very difficult to get a job in the media in Buffalo.
And still is.
It still is. And when I did, I worked for the Courier Express, and that was just an interesting experience. It was just an insane experience. It was good in the sense that I learned a lot, but it was so many battles on so many fronts until it would become discouraging sometime. And that was never my motive was never to end up with the white press anyway. That was never my intent.
So the battle was basically when you tried to do more reporting on issues that concern the black community.
Yeah, well, basically I couldn't. It was very difficult to get those issues. And I remember an incident where I fought hard to get the opportunity to interview Barbara Glover, the owner of Miss Barbara's School to Dance. They didn't really want me to do the interview. What had happened was Barbara had gotten these offers to dance on Broadway. So it was a great feature. And I interviewed Barbara, I did the story, I brought it back, and they didn't believe anything in the story. It was like unprecedented. They went through the story with a fine-tooth comb. They wanted me to call New York City. In other words, it was like I interviewed this woman and she was lying. That kind of experience. Well, I finally got the story published, but without a byline. They didn't even give me a byline for the story, which it really didn't matter to me because the story got out. So I wanted to do more reporting about black people, but I was sent South Buffalo, all over, to do stories about things that not only didn't interest me, but didn't interest people who look like me, and it was kind of discouraging. So my whole experience there was a learning experience. I was already very clear about the reality of media in America as it relates to black people, so nothing was a shock. But after a while, it got a little hairy, and they weren't crazy about me, I guess, and I wasn't crazy about them. But eventually, the paper folded. I left before it folded. In hindsight, I should have sued them. That was before it was popular to sue people for all kinds of discrimination. But at any rate, it was a learning experience. And I did some other things on the side. I worked for a magazine. I helped produce a magazine here back in the 70s, Bad Magazine. It was a black entertainment magazine. We only lasted 4 issues. I did a stint with Channel 29 when Channel 29 first came to the area. I was a copywriter there. I used to write commercials for them.
Okay.
I did that, and I just did a little bit of everything before I finally, and I even did a little bit with the Challenger, before I was finally able to get my foot really in the door and come down here and do what I always dreamed of doing, and that was to help turn it around.
So yeah, so let's go into that. What was it that brought you to the Challenger, and how would you work at turning the
Well,
Challenger
I was
around?
working for the state at the time. Very, quote, good job, benefits, retirement, just,
Well, that's always
you know,
good.
always good. But I really wasn't using the skills that I had acquired over the years to do anything to impact on my people or the community. So I was sort of at the right place at the right time. And Jim Bell had just purchased the Challenger, and I was working in a place where he frequented and came in, and one day he came in and he was looking very distraught because he had just bought this newspaper and he didn't really know what to do with it. And the door was open for me then. So I volunteered to help him out and to come down after work and help put things together because there was virtually no staff left and the paper had gone down quite a bit. After a couple of months of doing that, he offered me a job, a position, and because he couldn't pay me what I was worth, he offered me part ownership. So I left the state and all the security, and everybody thought I was crazy.
Same here when I did it.
Yeah, and I came down here, and that was 20 years ago. That was 20 years ago, and I don't regret not one single minute of it.
Okay.
Talk to us about exactly what it is that goes into putting together an issue of the Buffalo Challenger.
Well, a lot of energy goes into putting the Challenger together every week. It's basically a labor of love, and because of the condition that black people face in our community and really throughout America, it's almost a necessity to have your own communications vehicle. We don't just throw anything in the paper that comes in the mail, and we get tons of mail every day, tons of tons of press releases. We pick and choose the community news as priority. Unfortunately, we don't have the space to do as much national and international news as we'd like, but we dedicate one page to news update, and that's usually national and international briefs. So we rewrite and we write. I read about 3 papers a day at least. I read the news. I read USA Today and the New York Times. I read several black newspapers from around the country every week. I read Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report every week. I read a number of health journals every week. So it is a lot of reading and gleaning information. I'm on the web, I'm on the internet. I'm getting information from
On the internet every day.
Checking that out. So that when we put information in the paper, we're trying to give the community information they can really, really use. And we're trying to give them information that will expand their horizons and open their minds up. A lot of things happen in this city and in this country that we would never, ever know about if we depended on the media that we have right now. And that's by design, basically. So a lot of time goes into it, a lot of energy, a lot of love, a lot of frustration sometimes, because we don't have as many pages as we'd like to give our community all the information that we want.
Kind of like to be the same size as the Buffalo News if you could.
Actually, we would be very large if we had the advertising to afford us the opportunity to expand, but we don't. So we're a business, and I think that that's something that most people don't realize either. They think, I remember some years back I went to cover, it was a community meeting, and people were in an uproar because the state was talking about cutting back funding, and community-based organizations had organized, and they were ready to go to war. And I stepped up to the registration desk and greeted the sister who I knew, and she greeted me and she says, "Oh, are they going to cut your funding too?" And I thought that was phenomenal, because I said, "Well, we're not funded." She said, "Oh, well, how do you get your money?" And I said, "Well, we're a business." So people don't realize that we are a business. So I have 2 major hats, the hat of the editor and then the hat of the publisher, to keep the business going and to keep the business rolling. And that's the hard part.
I was going to ask you, since you mentioned that, for maybe someone that's not familiar, could you probably talk about compare and contrast the difference between an editor of a newspaper and a publisher?
Well, to be honest, to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure. I've carried that editor-publisher name so long,
Okay.
I don't know where the lines are all crossed up. But I know that there are two major factors involved in maintaining a publication. The publication itself has to meet certain standards if you're going to want people to read it, and if you're going to want to maintain some level of respect and credibility. But on the other hand, the business aspect of the newspaper has to be solid if you're going to print. And I might want to be 56 and 60 pages a week, but I would have been out of business years ago, because I wouldn't have had the advertising to sustain that many pages. We have to pay printers, we have to pay photographers, the overhead is tremendous, we have to keep the lights on, we have to keep the gas on. I mean, the gas company comes to visit me at least 5-6 times a year, and they come with the tools to cut my gas off. And so it's, you know, it's tough, because we're a small business as well. So we're a small business that's been around for 20 years, with a serious mission, and that is to keep our community informed and to afford them a platform to say what they want to say what's important to us. What's important to the majority community may not necessarily be important to us. In fact, 90% of what's important to the majority community, it's not important to us. What's important to us is what relates to us. So if it doesn't relate, that's why we don't read like we probably should. Black people read the Challenger religiously.
I read the Challenger.
No, they read it religiously, and they read it because they get information that they can use. They get information they can't get anywhere else, and they get an alternative view. If, for example, there's an issue that is dealt with by the major media, which is often dealt with incorrectly and insensitively. Well, thank you. And we have to then come in and get the facts straight. We have to lend that kind of sensitivity to what impacts on us.
Are there any features or stories in the Challenger that kind of stick out in your mind?
Well, actually, not really. There's so many. 20 years, that's a lot of stories. But I think that what really stands out in my mind is the fact that there are certain kinds of stories that keep reoccurring, that don't seem to ever end, and that were being published long before I came, and that are still being published. And that's the issue of police brutality against Africans. It's amazing to go back through the old papers and see the exact same issues, some of the issues with the exact same precincts in this city.
One in particular.
Yeah, one in particular. It's amazing. So when these kinds of stories come up, when these kinds of issues come up, it's not a shock, but it's like, when does it stop? You know, when do we stop doing these stories? We don't stop until the brutality stops, because it's our job to let people know that this is happening. And we were reporting police brutality stories long before it was vogue. There was a time the major media wouldn't touch them. And, you know, in years later, I mean, in recent years, they've had to, because like everything else, if it impacts on our community, eventually it's going to impact on the major community in the world. When drugs was big in the black community, it was no big deal. Drugs is all over now. It's a big deal. Other folks' children are drug addicts now. It's a big deal. Police brutality knows no color line now. When we still getting the brunt of the nightstick. But Mark, Virginia, there's been a couple of Caucasians who have died at the hands of the police department. The major media has been forced to deal with the reality. And I think America has a problem when they turn their heads and they put their heads in the sand they're going to be forced to pull their heads out, just like they are now with the issue of violence in this country. But nobody wants to deal with the real issue, and that is this country was founded on violence. Violent people founded this country. They called themselves Puritans, but they weren't very pure when they got here. And they had a field day on the Indians. Then they came and got the Africans and been kicking our butts ever since. So it's an interesting scenario to watch now. And that's basically what we're doing now, is watching.
Talk to us about some of the economic conditions that the Challenger has endured over the years.
Well, we've endured very hard economic conditions over the years. We've never seen a profit. If I ran this business based on whether or not I received a profit, the doors would have been closed many years ago. Many years ago. That's not why we're here. If we can maintain, keep the lights on, employ people, which we do, employ people, and do the work. We're just doing the work. It's a mission. And we're doing it without government funds, so no one can come in and cut my funding off if they don't like what I'm doing.
Sometimes that's the best way to do it, is without government funds.
We're doing it without selling out to any particular interest group, any particular political group, because we have to be free so that the community can get it all. We don't prevent anyone from saying basically anything they want to say, as long as it's not libelous. We try to watch that. But be they Republican or be they Democratic, Christian, Muslim, it doesn't, we don't hold barriers up. We are an African people, and anything that impacts on us, one impacts on us all. So we, again, we're on a mission, and the Creator has seen to it that we've been able to maintain, and I think that's the greatest miracle, that we're still here. It's been 36 years. I've been here for 20. That's a long time.
What are your views on the local media right here in the city of Buffalo?
Well, I guess in a nutshell, it's sorely lacking in sensitivity when it comes to African Americans, and depth. But on the other hand, I don't expect more. I don't expect any more from people who want to keep control. The media's job, basically, the major media, is to maintain the status quo. They want to keep whoever's in control in control. So their job, they're doing their job, and they're doing a very good job of it. Our job is to counter that as best as we can. Even though they say, they're moving toward diversity and they're doing this and that, you can look in the newsrooms, at least locally, and count the diversity. And you can look through the pages of the media and just see how they deal with issues that involve our children as opposed to issues that involve other children or other young people. It's classic, it's nothing new, it's racism, it's stereotypes. It hasn't ended, nothing has changed. And I don't expect anything to change. I hope and expect that we'll change, though, and do a better job of supporting what is ours. And that is the best way to get other people to respect you more, when you respect your own and you respect yourself. And I dare say that the little respect that we've gotten in this community from the major media has a lot to do with the existence of the black press, which they know is going to deal correctly with whatever issues they deal with incorrectly that impact on this community.
Now, Nisa, in your own words, why don't you explain to us what the importance of the black press is?
Well, the black press is our voice. We, every week, print on the front page a quote from Freedom's Journal, which was the first black newspaper published in America after slavery. No, actually, yeah, it was after slavery, because there were 30 published before we were free, if you can believe that. But Freedom's Journal, they used the quote in their a quote in their first editorial, and they said, "We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us." And that, I think, is the torchbearer for black newspapers across the country.
As a matter of fact, it's the theme for your newspaper.
It
isn't
is. That's our theme. We adopted that theme. When I first came here, the first thing I did was research. I went to the library and I researched all the old challengers to get a feel for just what it was that was driving the people that started this paper. And I was amazed at the strength and the integrity and the fearlessness of those founders, the people that founded this paper. Ambrose Lane was one of the first editors. Ambrose Lane was also the first black man to run for mayor in this city. Ambrose Lane was a prolific writer. Ambrose Lane was the most fearless black man I had ever read in print. And he quoted John Russ Warren, "We wish to plead our own cause," in one of his editorials back in the early 60s when the Challenger first started. And when I read it, it just jumped off the page. And I said, well, that's our legacy. That's what we have to do. We have to plead our cause. That's our job.
What would be your advice to a young person wanting to break into the media?
Well, the first thing I would advise is, of course, they get an education. That's your ticket. It doesn't really mean anything because you're not going to really learn anything until you get out into the field. But you have to have the ticket to get into the door. So you get your education, you write or read or do as much as you can in the field that you want to get into before you get into the field. And during the summers, if you can get internships, preferably with smaller newspapers or smaller media companies so you can get better hands-on experience. And then you go for it.
Nisa, in conclusion to this, what is it that the Buffalo community can do to keep supporting the Buffalo Challenger and keep it going out here in the city of Buffalo?
Well, they can keep reading. They can keep reading. They can ask when they shop if the place they shop, they're spending their hard-earned dollars, whether or not they advertise in their newspaper. That would help us because what that does is sensitize the retailers to the fact that we're aware and we're conscious consumers, because advertising is the backbone of any media, any publication. So while they're out there buying those shoes, or if they're in those upscale clothing stores, they can just ask politely, do you advertise in the Challenger? And they may say, oh, well, what is that? And they can explain, and who knows, we might get a phone call for information or for a media kit. But that's what keeps us going. I have to thank the community because we really do get very good support. I'm not complaining. The last thing I complain about is community support. You know, community support is very good under the circumstances. It's excellent. It, of course, could be better, but we have to do some things on our end to make it better, and we're trying every day to be better. And I think that's all any of us can do.
Well, Nisa, it was a pleasure having you on BCTV Tonight.
Thank you. I'm honored.